Hello and welcome to yet another episode on population studies. Gender equality is not yet realized in any society, in any part of the world. Men and women have different roles, responsibilities, and decision making powers, leading to disadvantages for women. It is therefore not surprising that gender also plays a role in relation to climate change. Yet the topic has not been explored sufficiently, and many people still find it difficult to comprehend the ways in which gender might be a factor in climate change or how it should be politically addressed. Gender aspects are rarely addressed in climate change policy. This applies with few exceptions to the national as well as the international level. Various reasons account for this neglect. Gender aspects in climate change are often not self-evident, and there is little data, research or case studies clarifying and exemplifying the linkages between gender justice and climate change. Nevertheless, there are a number of issues that point to the crucial role of gender when understanding the causes of climate change, aiming to mitigate it and working towards successful adaptation to inevitable climate change. Women and men in their respective social roles are differently affected by the effects of climate change. Reasons are inter alia to be found in different responsibilities for care work and income generating work, in dependency on natural resources because of lacking access to environmental services, or in knowledge and capacities to cope with the effects because of differences in the access to education and information systems. Women and men in their respective social roles are differently affected by climate protection and adaptation instruments and measures. If these mechanisms and measures are developed in a non-gender sensitive way, which most often is the case, they again do not take into account different responsibilities and financial options. Women and men differ with regard to their respective perceptions of and reaction to climate change. It is well known, especially in industrialized countries, that women have a higher risk perception than men, and thus also recognize climate change as a more serious problem than men do. Gender differences are crucial when it comes to assessing adequate measures too. While men trust in technical solutions, women vote stronger for lifestyle changes and reduction of energy consumption. Women's and men's contribution to climate change differs, especially with regards to their respective CO2 emissions. This is especially proven in regard to transport systems. For example, in Sweden, men consume up to double amounts of energy compared to women. Different results mostly from gendered car use and mobility patterns. Social roles and responsibilities of women and men lead to different degrees of dependency on natural environment. Women are usually the ones engaged in household subsistence activities. Thus, degradation of forests, watersheds, foreshores and agricultural land in developing countries can have a severe effect on their ability to perform daily household maintenance tasks. As the male perspective is dominating, climate protection and climate adaptation measures often fail to take into account the practical and strategical needs of the large parts of the population. Example, infrastructure, energy supply. The participation of women in decision making regarding climate policy, mitigation and adaptation, and its implementation in instruments and measures is very low. Thus, in general, it is men's perspectives which is taken into account in planning processes. Women and men are not homogeneous groups but include people of various age, ethnicity, education, income. These social categories also relate to differences in influence, attitude, and in contribution to climate change, to how people are affected by it and which possibilities they possess to adapt to climate change. This applies to developing as well as to developed countries. Principally, however, the situation of women in the global south differs significantly from situation in the global north. While women in the south are more dramatically affected by climate change, women in the north are expected to play a significant role as consumers without having appreciable influence on decision making as it relates to emission reduction. The same holds true for the adaptation to climate change. Women in south suffer most and have least capacities, that is economic, information, education, etc., to adapt to climate change and to prepare for the effects, whereas both women and men in the global north need to adapt their consumption behavior and daily life routines in order to mitigate climate change. They are differently affected by natural disasters and changing weather conditions too. Research about extreme weather conditions show that women and elderly people are most sensitive to hot summer weather in terms of mortality, and that women perceive hot and dry summer weather more unfavorably than men and are more likely to change their behavior. The impacts of climate change on women's life. As predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate change impacts will be differently distributed among different regions, generation, age classes, income groups, occupation and genders. The IPCC also notes that the impacts of climate change will hamper development and harm human living conditions and lifestyles. The effects will fall disproportionately upon developing countries and the poor within all countries, and thereby exacerbate inequities in health status and access to adequate food, clean water and other resources. Today, women represent about 70% of the poor throughout the world. Most of the key areas of the negative consequences of the climate change are strongly connected to gender equality issues. Women in developing and developed countries are generally considered part of the vulnerable groups. High dependence from agriculture, forest resources, fisheries and biofuels can increase the vulnerability and the risk of environmental depletion. Moreover, the problems relating to the management of the environmental common assets can become worse under the pressure of global warming. These problems include food security, fresh water supply, rural and urban settlements and their infrastructures. The impact on women's life varies between regions and cultures. Thus, planning for adaptation to climate change need to take a close look at each individual and concrete situation. Now, mainstreaming gender into climate change debates, experiences and recommended strategies. As mentioned in the beginning, gender aspects currently are poorly addressed in climate. However, it is not only research and international institutions related to climate change that are lacking gender perspectives. The same applies to donor organizations and development departments in national governments of industrialized countries. And it is for the same reasons lacking gender sensitivity and lacking knowledge on how to integrate gender perspectives and what the specific women or gender aspects are in a concrete situation oblique measure. In the same time, it is the very technical and science oriented view to climate protection and often to adaptation to climate change too that make people believe that policies are gender neutral. So, which strategy would be the best to overcome these shortcomings and to ensure the integration of gender perspectives in climate change debates and measures? According to experiences in implementing gender mainstreaming into institutions, there are some preconditions for a successful reorganizations from a gender perspective. It is more promising to integrate gender into new developments and new planning instead of trying to gender projects, measure programs which are already running. This is why, for example, the post-Kyoto period might provide a better possibility than the already accepted Kyoto Protocol. This might be the case as well if new guidelines or methodologies are developed. Example, for national reporting or national adaptation plans. Gender mainstreaming needs strong support of the top of the organization institution to force departments to include gender perspectives and undertake gender assessments of each policy and measure they are planning. Nevertheless, when it comes to implementation, strong support and requirements from bottom up are needed. And last but not the least, gender mainstreaming has to be done in every institution. Thus, it has to be implemented into the UNFCCC as well as in the national and local organizations dealing with climate change. Experiences and findings from the lower levels will help the upper levels to argue for gender mainstreaming and the other way around. Gender disaggregated data taken at each of the levels will provide a strong database for future actions and measures to be gender aware. To support these processes, gender training have to be carried out aiming to sensitize people for the gender relevance of the work they are doing. Gender experts must be involved in all stages of the planning to back the people planning or carrying out the projects programs with gender knowledge. Mainstreaming gender into adaptation programs and measures. Gender in adaptation measures. As shown above, climate change impacts women's lives differently than men's. Consequently, adaptation policies and measures need to be gender sensitive. Restricted access to economic resources may lead to less possibilities to adapt to climate change. Example, to changing weather conditions and their impacts on agricultural activities. Less possibilities of protection against natural disasters and recovering in the aftermath. Lacking control over land oblique property effects, the ability to crop changes or switching to other fields of income generation. Lack of transport systems leads to more time consumption and physical burdens like transportation of heavy loads over long distances. The lacking access to political resources like influence, networks, information, skills or control over decision making leads to poor participation in the project and program development and poor recognition of the practical and strategic needs of women and girls. The concurrence of economic disadvantage, lacking access to resources and information, dependency on male family members and lack of power contribute to women's situation as a particular vulnerable group. To understand the implications of adaptation measures for all people involved, it is necessary that all members of an adapting community are represented in climate change planning and governance processes. Women, however, are often expected to contribute unpaid labor while being absent from the planning and governance processes, but equal involvement of men and women and their respective needs and perspectives in adaptation planning are important, not only to ensure that the measures developed actually benefit those who are supposed to implement them, but also to ensure that all relevant knowledge is integrated into policy and projects. Now, this is from COP10 Women's Statement. Additionally, it is reported from post-disaster situations that natural disasters may provide women with unique opportunities to challenge and change their gendered status in society. In the aftermath, they take active role in traditionally male tasks and develop new skills such as natural resource and agricultural management, which in the right environment they could transfer into the job market. To support women in these situations may help to valorize their usually undervalued work and products. Available knowledge about impacts in area where women are involved in dependent on areas which will be affected by climate change and where adaptation measures should be implemented include water, agriculture, nutrition, energy, transport, housing, forestry, fishery, coastal zone management, biodiversity, natural disasters, conflicts, risk management. Regarding the energy issue, a wide range of studies from many developing countries can be found at the website of Energia, the international network for gender and sustainable energy. The Gender and the Water Alliance has a website with detailed information and resources on gender aspects in integrated water resource management. The same applies for Gender and Disaster Network, which also has got a website which provides a gender and disaster source book on their website as well as checklists and practical guidance. Now, the financing adaptation, assuring benefits for women. Most available environmental finance mechanisms have limited benefits for disadvantaged given their lack of capital, skills and knowledge and market access. Typically, these funds are dominated by men's interests and require strengthening of gender concerns and making them accessible for women. The same hold true for financing mechanism under the UNFCCC. Therefore, a basic requirement is to undertake a gender analysis for each new funding mechanisms. Questions to be asked are, for example, who has the access to and control over funds and benefits? How are expenditures allocated amongst women and men? Are cultural, societal, religious, educational inequalities addressed in the allocation criteria? One of the most serious general problems is the small amount of money available in the adaptation funds. If the funds are small, it is even harder to promote gender sensible criteria or projects which address women's need because pressure of demand on the small budget is high and women's need usually do not have the power to prevail. Nevertheless, it is important to steer adaptation projects towards the most vulnerable group, women. The best way to do so is to develop the projects to be founded on grassroots level in a participatory process by women and men. Now we come to the conclusion. To ensure success, adaptation policies and measures need to be gender sensitive. In principle, gender could be integrated relatively easy into, for example, stakeholder analysis, livelihood analysis and multi-criteria decisions tool if the users were aware of the need and choose to do this. There are a lot of tools available aiming at integrating gender perspectives into developing planning. These tools need to be adopted into adaptation policies, programs and measures, and should be tested and evaluated. Another critical question is how gender awareness among planners and project developers can be stimulated. Gender training is the common instrument to sensitize those persons. In the long run, it should be part of education of each planner. Until then, it must be an obligatory part of the advanced vocational training. Some critical points. Number one, it is important to have in mind that equal participation in terms of numbers does not automatically guarantee representation of women's concerns. Therefore, there is a need to include gender expertise into projects wherever possible. Number two is particular emphasis should be put on conflicting effects. For example, relief assistance in response to natural disaster may cultivate dependency on foreign help instead of strengthening, empowering people. Number three, when looking at women's and men's different needs, it is mostly the immediate necessities, that is water, shelter, food, income and health care within a specific situation which are addressed. Strategic interests, on the other hand, refer to the relative status of the women and men within society. These interests vary in each context and are related to roles and expectations, as well as to gender divisions of labor, resources and power. Strategic interests may include gaining legal rights, closing wage gaps, protection from domestic violence, increased decision making and women's control over their bodies. To ensure sustainable benefits, both practical needs and strategic interests must be taken into account in the design of policies, programs and projects. Thank you so much for watching.